is our second session of our Scholar Spotlight for the Deaf and Dying Scholars. So tonight we have the privilege to speak with Dr. Carolyn Ellis, who is a legend in communication. I feel like we're speaking with a communication celebrity today. Dr. Ellis is a distinguished university professor emerita of communication and sociology at the University of South Florida. She's established an international reputation for her contributions to the narrative study of human life, having published extensively in qualitative methods, storytelling, emotions, and loss and trauma. She integrates ethnographic, literary, and evocative writing in short stories, research articles, and documentaries to portray and make sense of lived experience and cultural context. She is best known as an originator and the developer of autoethnography, literally wrote the books on autoethnography, a reflexive approach to research, writing, and storytelling that connects the autobiographical and personal to the cultural, social, and political. Seeking to do research that has the possibility of improving human lives and enhancing social justice, she is currently engaged with the survivors of the Holocaust in collaborative and compassionate interviews guided by a relational ethics of care. Her most recent books are Evocative Autoethnography, Writing Lives and Telling Stories with Arthur Bachner, and Final Negotiations, a story of love, loss, and chronic illness, expanded and revised. So thank you, Dr. Ellis, so much for speaking with us tonight. We have a couple questions to ask you. Feel free to answer in whatever way moves you, or if it makes you think of something else, feel free to add on. So the first question that we have for you is, how did you find yourself in communication studies? From my understanding of reading your book, Final Negotiations, that's not your background. Your background was originally elsewhere. So how did you find yourself in communication studies? And specifically, how did you find yourself in end-of-life, death and dying work?
Okay, I'm going to do them in reverse. And by the way, I'm really happy to be here, and I'm just honored that you want to interview me and talk with me, and I want to know more about all of what you're doing. I think it's just fantastic. So it's just really a pleasure. So let me start with how I got involved in end-of-life grief loss studies, because that happened some time before I actually got into communication. So all my degrees are in sociology, and I was in a sociology department at University of South Florida, and considered myself a qualitative methodologist and interested in social psychology. And I was doing a study on jealousy among undergraduate in the university. And at that point, my brother, my younger brother, was killed in an airplane crash on his way to visit me. He was 29. And in addition to that, my partner of 8 years had a chronic illness and was nearing the end of his life. And so I felt overwhelmed by loss, especially the one with my brother, would just really sent me into a tizzy. And I found myself, usually am very optimistic and fun-loving, and I found myself really pretty depressed about all of it and thinking, what am I going to do? How am I going to get through this? Being an ethnographer, which I had been, I always say I was born an ethnographer, I decided to start writing some notes about what was going on. And so with the approval of my partner, I said, I want to just start writing about, losing my brother, writing about what's happening with you, because he was in and out of emergency rooms and in the hospital and was having serious problems. And he said, okay, whatever helps, go ahead and do it. So I started taking notes on everything that was going on. And I found the notes, I thought, to be the best sociology I'd ever written. And I also found writing notes to be very therapeutic for me. When I was sitting there writing field notes, it's like it was normal. It's a normal environment. I wasn't in the chaos. And I also found that sitting and writing field notes helped me kind of take a breath, and say, okay, what's going on? What needs to be done now? What can I right here and kind of push to the side to be dealt with at some other point? And so that was really therapeutic in clearing my head. So then, a year later, or less than a year, my partner died. I continued taking these notes, and I had all this stack of notes, and what to do with it. And I won't take you into the whole story, but after many attempts of, having control groups of storytelling and, so on, I said, that's not what I want to do. I just really want to write my story. But that's, of course, not how I had been educated to do sociology. But I sat down and started writing and teaching myself to write in a more literary way, and ended up with 700 pages, this manuscript, which became Final Negotiations. And in the middle of all that, I stopped and wrote an article about doing systematic sociological introspection as a way of doing social science research. And that was written in a much more theoretical, conceptual way. I was writing in the language of the mainstream, to try to get them to pay attention to me and think about how what I was advocating, which is studying lived experience from a personal perspective, how that could fit into sociology. So in the middle of all the, so now we get up to 1990, which is a watershed year for me. And I was giving a talk in the business school. I'm still in sociology. I was giving a talk in the business school of all places on systematic sociological introspection. And I remember walking over there saying, nobody is going to care about this. But, I said I would do it, so I'm going to do it. And I was going to read from what was becoming my novel about losing my partner, and pretty emotional kinds of stories that I was going to tell. So I got up and I did my presentation, and there was a man in the audience I didn't recognize, but I did think he was kind of cute. And he starts asking me all these questions. And up till that point, all the questions that I had gotten had been, but how is this social science? And how is this research? And this is about your experience, but it doesn't tell me about my experience. If you have to write this for therapeutic reasons, go ahead, but that's not sociology. Okay, but here this person who became Art Bachner, who was Art Bachner, started asking me questions about, why are you so defensive? And why don't you just let the stories do their work? And I was kind of blown away by this perspective. And so that questioning, I'll go back to what happened with him and me, but that questioning plus I had gotten a review. First, my systematic sociological introspection paper got several rejections, and it got rejected from this mainstream social psych journal. And the editor said, well, I kind of like this, but I'm afraid to publish it because then I'll get all these little stories and I won't know what to do with them. But that paper finally got accepted, and the reviewer from the journal that accepted it ended up being Norman Denson. And he wrote, this author is schizophrenic. She tries to use literary humanistic ways to do social science, and then she wants to turn it against itself, And I thought, wow. And that, with art's questioning and everything that continued to happen, really made me think that I'm going to quit knocking on the door of sociology and saying, let me in. And I want to find people who want to do what I want to do, who care about what the kinds of things I care about, who want to take a humanistic perspective, and look at life as lived instead of only in an abstract way. So Art walks me to the car after the meeting, and we talk, and he was he was chair of the communication department, and they had started a PhD in interpretive methods, interpretive social science, which was all about qualitative methods. And I was in the sociology department. We only had a master's degree, but it was very oriented toward qualitative methods. And we started talking about trying to get the two programs together in some way and really build on our strengths. And so, one thing leads to another, and I invited him to my house to talk about putting these programs together. And I just, happened to dim the lights and have a bottle of wine. But as I said, one thing leads to another, and we became not just colleagues, but we became romantic partners as well. And we're still together here, however many years later, 34 years later. And that was a real turning point in that I had felt I was out in the world doing this all by myself. And now I had a partner who was as invested in it all as I had been. In fact, he said, when I heard you talk, I said, she's giving my talk, because that's the kind of thing he had been thinking about on a more theoretical level, more macro level. And now he felt I was showing how we could do this together. So we got together in 1990. It was 1996 that before 1996, I was working with their graduate students. I was teaching classes to their graduate students. I was teaching a class in qualitative methods, one in personal narrative, I called it at the time, and just so invested in that program. And so when he suggested, why don't you move over to our program? I jumped for the chance. Now, it was scary because, you devote yourself to a discipline. All your friends and people are in that discipline. Now you're going to move over and have to learn I'd never had a communication course at that point. But I moved. The department accepted me into the department, and that started really a 24-year partnership of developing this interpretive program that was oriented toward autoethnography and qualitative methods and critical studies, with a lot of emphasis on loss and trauma and grief and emotions and love. Art taught a course on love. I taught a course on grief. And that's how I got into communication. And I thought at the time, oh, well, I'll be able to keep my ties in sociology. I'll go to sociology conventions and stay involved. But you really can't do that. You only have so much time and energy. And so all of our students were going to the communication conferences. They were having to get jobs in communication. And so I found myself just totally immersed in communication. And we started an ethnography division, which was really good because we didn't have that before in communication. And I really felt accepted in communication. And I didn't feel, there were battles and there were sides, but they weren't the same as in sociology, where, if you didn't do quantitative methods, you weren't considered really a sociologist. And I didn't feel that in communication. I felt there were a lot of places for us, and the reception to ethnography was just phenomenal. So that's how I got into communication, and I still have never had a communication course, but I very much consider myself a communication scholar at this point.
Wow, such a amazing story. It almost sounds like a movie, like the role of destiny and all of this happening. It's so intense, and it's so great to hear.
Amazing. It was pretty amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, and you've taught so many communication classes, but still haven't taken one. That's excellent.
But I've gotten it by osmosis and living with art. Whenever, we have conversations all the time. And so I'm always learning communication, and from my students too.
Aren't we all?
Yeah.
Always learning communication.
Yes.
So we're wondering too, because you have such a vast body of research and writing. Of all of your writing, has any particular study or thing that you've written really stuck out to you as having a profound impact or left a lasting impression?
Well, and I thought a little bit about this today, and it's hard to choose one, but I do. There are several pieces that I keep coming back to, whether I'm doing a workshop or telling people, giving them ideas about what to read or referring to my work. They just keep popping up over and over. And they all were really early in my career. One of them is There Are Survivors, which was about my brother's death. And that had such an impact on me. I entitled it There Are Survivors, and I really felt that piece helped me survive the loss of my younger brother. And I get so much response about that piece, and still do, of people who have read it and have lost people suddenly. And then there are two others that I want to mention. One is Final Negotiations. How can I not mention that? That relationship lasted 9 years, and it took me 9 years to write the book. And when I told you I had that 700 pages, and what I didn't tell you is that when Art and I got together, I handed him that 700 pages and said, what do I do with this? And we had, months of discussion about it and how to frame it and what it was about and what to leave out. And I rewrote it, I don't know how many times. So, and I felt that really was the beginning of evocative autoethnography, even though I only use that word once in the book. And we were talking about personal narrative, and we had just a whole bunch of other terms for what we were doing. But soon after writing that book, we decided to use the term autoethnography, that was the one we really were committed to. So that was kind of the beginning of autoethnography. And then I also want to mention a third one. I know you asked for one, but maternal connections, which was about taking care of my mother. And that's one that I use in a lot of workshops. And I always apologize and say, you probably read this already, but it works so well to get people to see the value of autoethnography and the theory and conceptual material that is there in the stories without you pointing it out. And everybody can identify with taking care of a sick mother. If they can't, they anticipate what it will be like to take care of theirs. And even if they think it will be very different from my taking care of mine, it opens up these conversations that are just so rich and shows what autoethnography can do. So they're three of my favorites still.
So since you brought it up, I wanted to jump ahead to a question. So your book, Final Negotiations, which is a classic, Death Scholars, if you have not read this book, please pick it up or read it. It's a must read. In autoethnography and communication and death studies. It's a moving narrative reflection on the end-of-life caregiving that you did, and you write very candidly and honestly. I just reread it before our interview today to try to refresh, and it's so poignant, and it's got so much to unpack in that book. Can you talk to us a little bit about the writing process? Because you mentioned that book as a catalyst or springboard for autoethnography and evocative narrative. How were you able to sit down and write about such a deep and impactful experience in a an outsider perspective, outside looking in at your own life even?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for reading it. And I do want to say that there is an expanded, more recent version, and unfortunately kind of gets lost, but it has a preface by Art, it has a new introduction by me, and a new epilogue. And I probably should have published some of that separately, because I think it does get lost because people already have Final Negotiations, so they don't want to buy, a new edition, which I understand. I feel like I had to write that piece. I had, because that relationship had been so complex for me. He had been my professor. He was 20 years older than I was. He was ill when I met him, and yet here I am, this young Southern girl, off in New York with the New York intelligent folks, and trying to figure out who I am. And now he's died, and here I am. Who am I? What was that relationship about? What did it mean to me? What can I learn about it and from it? And how can I use that to figure out who I want to be now and who I can be in the future? So it became a real identity project for me, and also a commitment to, this is the kind of prose we don't have out there. We don't have people's lived experiences, where not as a model, but just as a possible way it could happen to, open up these conversations to make you think about, people you love and losing them, and what it's going to be like and how you're going to be. And I wanted to show, I thought it really important to not show me as a rescuer, but as all my warts and all his warts, which of course gets me into trouble sometimes, because people will say, well, we didn't like either character. Well, if you put all your warts on the page, I probably wouldn't like you either. But I felt it important to humanize who we are in all our complexity, and to offer companionship to people who would be going through these kinds of experiences, and to help myself cope with the fact that, I'm going to keep losing people. If I'm fortunate enough to stay alive for a while, I'm going to lose more people. How do I cope with this? what can I learn from writing and analyzing and reflecting and rewriting that might help me in these situations and might help some other people as well. So it really became, a life project to do that work. And how did I write? I mean, it was a struggle. As I said, I had 700 pages because I wrote it as an ethnographer, kind of this happened and then this happened and this happened. And I had notes for the last year of his life, but I went back and I felt like, well, people won't be that involved in the loss if they haven't been engaged in the attachment. So I went back to the beginning of our relationship, and I had calendars and notebooks and things. And so I really wrote from event to event and tried to figure out, remember and write as well as I could. And of course, you can't remember exactly what happened, but that it isn't a project about exactly what happened. It's a project about memory and constructing the way you think it could have been or might have been. Because that's the best we have. Once something happens, we don't have it anymore. We only have partial understanding, partial memory of what happened. And so how do I make the best out of that to tell an evocative story that will pull people into the story and make them think about their lives or think about the kinds of things that happened to me. And so, in the process, my whole academic world is changing because I'm going from, the whole emphasis on representation to an emphasis on how do you write something that's, as truthful as it can be, but the emphasis is not on accuracy, it's on evocation. How do you evoke and engage other people to open up to conversations about these kinds of issues?
So it sounds like disclosure of some of these words that you're talking about is necessary to get your audience to connect, open up.
It is.
Yeah, and
to be believable. Yes.
yeah.
And so that you can have insight yourself. I mean, if you're just presenting yourself as perfect, you're not getting much insight.
And along with
But
that, do you have like maybe 2 or 3 tips that you would give new people to autoethnography who are just dipping their toes in or finding themselves in autoethnography or ethnography as communication scholars if they're dealing with death, dying, grief, or even a sensitive topic? Are there like 2 or 3 tips that you could share?
One is to take care of themselves. That's a big one because it doesn't matter how much we deal with this as scholarship, it's still a personal thing. It's something that we all have to deal with and aren't completely comfortable with it and don't know how often to deal with it. I'll give you one example of something that happened to me. I was teaching grief and loss. I was writing final negotiations. I was dealing with other losses in my life. A dog had died and so on. And I remember I remember this moment sitting in my office, and students came all the time to talk about their losses and so on. And I appreciated that, and I respected that. But this kid came in, and he was talking about losing like a sister or a cousin or a uncle's aunt who lives in. I mean, it was just really far removed, and that wasn't an issue. But it was just like I all of a sudden felt like I can't do this right now. I just can't do this. And I said to him, I can't do this right now. Maybe I can talk to you later. And I went home and said, you are too involved in grief. It is too much a part of your life. You have got to figure out how to compartmentalize a little bit and be in the moment and really living your life. Now, I believe you should always keep death on your shoulder, should always be there to remind you that life is finite, that you should make good decisions and live the kind of life you want to live and do what needs to be done because you won't be here forever. And I also think we should live life thinking that the people we love could die any day. So how do we want to be with them and toward them? So in that way, I do keep death in my life, but I don't want to just be constantly thinking about it. I want to be out playing with my puppy. I want to be just totally into joy. And tip number 2 is the importance of portraying lived experience of how people talk with each other who are dying, who are caregiving. I finished a piece a few months ago about it's called Autoethnographic Conversations with My Dying Sister. And she died Thanksgiving Day this past year. And before that time, we would have these conversations, and she would say to me, "You write about everybody else. Why don't you write about me?" I said, "Okay, I'll write about you." And so we'd have these conversations, and I'd take notes, and sometimes I would audio tape what we were talking about. And they were very mundane kinds of discussions in many ways. And then in other ways, they were very profound discussions. And she and I were very different. She went to it was more Pentecostal than Pentecostal church, and she was into speaking in tongues and healing, hands-on healing, and that after death she would see everybody she had lost, and they'd all be there, and God would be there, and this would be a new journey. And I don't have those kinds of beliefs, but the conversations show how do you talk with each other anyway, even if you are so different, and care about each other and listen to each other. And what are these conversations like? I mean, people are dying, they don't stop having conversations. So second point would be, let's talk more about the lived experience of caregiving and dying and coping with grief and loss. The abstraction is great. The demographic variables are really insightful, but that you can't. There's nothing like that. Just lived experience. What does it feel like moment to moment, and how do you get through it? So there are two, and I could probably come up with more, but those are the two most important ones, I think. And have a community like the one you guys have put together of people to talk to and support you and read your work and help you therapeutically if you get in a bind.
Yeah, thank you. All excellent advice. And you actually touched on one of the next questions that we have is you were mentioning how the lived experience is something that we really need to talk about, the day-to-day of death, dying, grief. Are there other areas, so you mentioned lived experience, but lived experience, other areas that you would say future death and dying scholarship should examine or really take a look at, or things that you think, in your opinion, are just under-examined?
Well, I seem to have lots of things about suicide coming across my desk these days. And I thought, that is something we need to truly investigate. And I've gotten pretty close to Mike Alvarez, who I know is part of your group, and his work. And, he's now writing some more work. And I just think it's phenomenal, and has just opened up this area that I thought we just all kind of stayed away from, but to talk about what the lived experience, again, the lived experience, but he does it all. He does every level of analysis about suicide and what it means and how it's lived and so on. So I think some of those kinds of things that we've just neglected to talk that much about would be important to do more work in. Some of the neurodivergent stuff that people are having to deal with, I seem to be seeing a lot more of that kind of thing being talked about. I would like more about Alzheimer's, memory loss. So those are just kind of some of the kinds of things I would be interested in.
So you open the door to this, so I will leave it here for other death scholars. You said you always respond to people who reach out to you. Is that an invitation that if death scholars are interested in autoethnography or have questions, that they can reach out to you?
Sure. And sometimes those responses are shorter than others, or sometimes I can connect them to other people. But no, I will respond unless I just miss something. That can happen, and when you don't answer an email right away and it gets put in the pile of going back to, and sometimes you forget to go back. But no, I will respond, and I would love to hear from other people talking about death and dying.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank
What a
you.
delightful conversation this has been. And thank you for playing with us with the Death Cafe questions. That was great.
Oh, of course. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And now I will go walking with my two dogs and my husband, and I will tell him all about the questions and the interaction and how much fun it was.